We're here on Daf Yud Gimel, and we're up to Shalcha Rav Acha Barav Lakami de Ravina. We had a statement earlier on this Amud of Rava, and according to Rava, in a case of a machzeles shel hadas, where he gave her a machzeles, some sort of a mat made of myrtles, and inside the mat was wrapped up some money, a significant amount of money, and he gave it to B'toras Kiddushin. So from the get-go, he gave the machzeles for the purpose of Kiddushin. Now, even though the machzeles per se is not worth a shava pruta, but he never retracted his interest and his desire to be Makadisha. So therefore, when he comes back and he says that, look, inside the machzeles wrapped up are bags of coins, he wants to be Makadisha with that. And therefore, in such a case, Rava says that if she's not interested in Kiddushin, then she should throw it back at him and refuse to accept it, because she has no responsibility in case it gets lost, because she never accepted as a pikadon, as opposed to the case where he gave us something as a pikadon, then he turns around and he says, well, let it be kesef Kiddushin. There we understand that even though she rejects the Kiddushin, but she didn't want to throw it back at him because she would be responsible insofar as she accepted a chiyuv shmira. But in the case of Rava, the machzeles, where from the get-go he gave it to her for Kiddushin, then even though the machzeles per se is not worth a pruta, but nevertheless, the fact that she didn't throw it back at him because she has no responsibility, that indicates that she is indeed interested in Kiddushin. Shalcha Rav Acha bar Rav Lakami de Ravina ki hai gavna mai. He sends a question to Ravina. What would be the din in this case? If she didn't return the machzeles with the mos in it, does that prove to us that she wants the Kiddushin? And Sholach Le Ravina answered b'tshuva to that question that Anan lo shmiya lehad Rav Huna bereid Rav Yeshua. We never heard that logical distinction that was presented by Rav Huna bereid Rav Yeshua, in which case he differentiated between the case where lechatchila he gave her something b'toras pikadon, and then he wanted to make it into a kesef Kiddushin, as opposed to Rava's case, where from the beginning he gave it to her for Kiddushin. And therefore we don't have this compelling reason to be choshesh for Kiddushin. We hold that the fact that she didn't give it back to him is not in any way indicative of the fact that she wants Kiddushin. However, Atun, but you heard and received that transmission of Rav Huna, and his question on Rava as to why Rava makes an equation between one case and the other when there's a clear distinction is choshule. You have to be choshesh for the opinion of Rav Huna that in the case of machzeles, since she didn't give back the money, therefore it might indicate that she really wanted to accept the Kiddushin. Hence, you have to be choshesh and require a get from the first Makadesh. And it wouldn't be sufficient if the second Makadesh would give her a get. The Gemara now tells another story about a woman who was quiet when the mos were given to her. And there are two interpretations here. We're definitely talking about Varshake, which is Meshi. Some say that she was selling Meshi. Others interpret that she was wearing a belt that was made out of Meshi. Meshi is this kind of a silk. And also, somebody comes along and he grabs the Meshi out of her hands. He rips the belt away or that which she was selling on the market, he takes away. Omar le. And she says to him, Havanil, give it back to me. It's mine. Omar lo, he says to her, if I offered to give this to you, will you marry me? Shakle vishtake. She grabbed it back and she said nothing. Omar of Nachman, Yichol Omar, in Shakli Lididi Chavshi. Yes, it's true that I took this meshi and I received it, but I only did it because it's mine. My shtika is no proof that I had any intention to get married to you. Eisvei Ravler of Nachman. Rava raises an objection to Rav Nachman's ruling from the following brisa. Kidsha, if he married her off with an object that he had grabbed away from her, begezel ubechamas ubegneva, o shechatav sela miyadav ekidshabo mikudeshes. Even though he's returning to her that which is rightfully hers that he had stolen from her, and he's asking her to accept it as Kiddush, we don't have any inhibitions. We assume that if she accepted it, she is accepting Kiddushin. And what happened to your svara of Nachman of in shakli lididi shakli? I'm only taking back that which is mine. So if Nachman answers, Hasam b'deshidech, the case in the Brisa, where the Brisa validates the Kiddushin because she didn't say anything, and she received and accepted these belts made of meshi, that's because they had already decided amongst themselves to get married. And that's called b'deshidech. So there was a discussion between them beforehand, and she decided, yes, I'll marry you. And then when he gives her this chayfetz, which he had grabbed away from her, but he gave it to her now for Shem Kiddushin, we're assuming that the reason why she was shosekes is because she wants to get married to him. She was, after all, already mishudeches. But in the case that came in front of me, there was no shidduchim. A man met a woman in the shuk, grabbed something away from her, gives it back to her for the sake of Kiddusha, and she was shosekes. That's not a raya that she wanted to be mekudeshes. So the Gemara asks, Uminoa Tamra. Rav Nachman actually is asking to himself, from where do I prove to you that there is such a distinction between shadich and lo shadich? The shani levi shadich. The sanya, I learned it from a Bryce. A man owes money to a woman. And he says, Kinsi sela zushani chayav lichi. Here, take this seller that I owe you. V'chazar v'omar lo. And then he says to her, Haskachi libo. So what's the din now? First, he gave it to her as a piron chov because he owes her that money. Now he's saying that money should be kesef kiddushin. So the Brisa makes the following distinction. B'shas matan mos, if his change of heart took place before she really got the seller, the money. In other words, before the money, the seller got into her hands, he said, no. I want this not to be a piron chov, but rather I want this to be kesef kiddushin. Rotzasa, if she was nisratzes to the kiddushin, areizim v'kudeshes. Lo rotzasa, Eino mekudeshes. But li'achar mos, if after he paid up his chov, he says to her, I want to be mekadesh you with that money that I gave you as piron chov afilu rotzasa. Even if she says, I want to marry you, Eino mekudeshes. So now Rav Nachman is going to interpret this brisa in such a way that he can prove his distinction between shadich and lo shadich. My rotzasa, umay lo rotzasa. Says Rav Nachman, let's analyze the brisa. What is rotzasa? What's lo rotzasa? Elam, if you're going to tell me rotzasa means the omra in, she said explicitly, I want to marry you. And lo rotzasa is just the opposite. The omra lo, she said explicitly, I'm not interested in marrying you. Then the implication would be had ishtika, if she said nothing, then have a Kiddushin. Because it's only when she says lo ratzasa, meaning where the Omra beferish lo, I don't want to be miskadosh to you, then there's no Kiddushin, but shtika would be Kiddushin. And if that be the case, then we have a difficulty in the language of the Brisa. Why does the Brisa have to tell me a distinction between ratzasa and not ratzasa? Nisne mekudesh stam. Tell me a bigger chiddush, that even if she was shosekes, she did not say neither nay nor yea. She didn't say, I want to marry you. She didn't say, I don't want to marry you. It was just stam. Is the Brisa could have told me that in that case of stam, where she didn't reject his offer of Kiddushin, then she would be Mekudeshes because she didn't reject it. And now for sure we would derive the conclusion that if she refused explicitly to Mekadosh him, then the Kiddushin would not be Chal. But in Shaska, she is Mekudeshes. There's no need for the Brisa to really tell me that if she refuses the Kiddushin, I'm not interested in marrying you, it's not Kiddushin. The Brisa wants to tell me that in the case of Stam, then it is valid Kiddushin. And then we would know from that if it's a case of Beferish where she says, I'm not interested in Kiddushin, it's not Kiddushin. Because again, the Gemara is pressing that the Bryce has no need to tell me something which is absolutely simple and basic, that if she refuses the Kiddushin, it's not Chal. So now Rav Nachman continues, and he says, Ki Hossam. We had a brisa that we quoted back on Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis, in which a man says to a woman, Kinsi Sela Zu Bipi Kadon, and then he comes back B'Shas Matan Mos, and he says, it's Kadshi Libo. And the Tana there says Stam, even though she didn't respond neither yea nor nay, he Mekudeshes. And the Brisa didn't bother telling me that if she said explicitly, I'm not interested in marrying you, that it's not Kiddushin. That was understood. So why is it here that the Brisa doesn't tell me the case of Shosekes? Ella, but therefore we have to reinterpret Ratza and Lo Ratza. Ratza in, she said explicitly yes, like we said before. But Lo Ratza saw the Ishtika, which means she didn't give a positive statement, I want to marry you. She was just silent, without responding. Vikatani. And the Brisa says about this in the Reisha, the Eino Mekudeshes, even though he said to her, let this money be Kesef Kiddushin B'Shas Matan Mos. And now we have to ask the following kasha. If you're saying that since she was Shosekes B'Shas Matan Mos, my time, is Yechola Meimari Shakli V'Didicha Shakli. It's got to be that the reason why she's not Mekudeshes, in the case of the Reisha, where it was B'Shas Matan Mos, it must be because she could say, in Shakli, I took back the seller because it's my seller. Ella Kashahach. So if Nachman now finishes up his proof, and he says the Brisa is difficult, the Brisa that we quoted back on Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis, because it says there the Kidsha, that if he was Mekadisha with a chayfetz that he had stolen from her, begezel b'chamas b'gneva, or shechatav selam miyad v'kidsha mekudeshes. Why should she be mekudeshes? Can't she say ata shali lakachti l'didin in l'didi chatvi or shakli? So basically, what do we do with this steer between the two brisos? Says Rav Nachman, we have no option other than to say Lav Shmamino had the shadich v'had the lo shadich. The brisa that says she is mekudeshes, that's talking about a case where they were already nishtadfu, and then we can assume that she wanted to accept the Kiddushin even from something that was stolen from. But the brisa that we had, that if he was Makadisha with a chov that he owes her, she's not mekudeshes, that's below shadich. There was never shidduchim between them, and therefore she's not mekudeshes. Kinach nafshei de Rav Asi, when Rav Asi died, Ailu Rabbana l'nektutei l'shmaita. They gathered together in the Beis Medrash to collect all his statements, that they shouldn't forget it. I mean, they couldn't write it down, maybe, but they could review it. And they made an announcement. They declared, anyone who has a shmua from Rav Asi, please come forward and share it with us. We have an equation between the kinyonim of kesef, of karka, of a soda, and the kinyonim of kesef and isha. Just like in the case of an isha, he cannot be makadisha and be konaha with less than a shava pruta. That's Beis Hillel. Is so too in the case of karka. You cannot purchase karka with something that's less than a shava pruta. So Gemara asks, Amru le the Chacham said to Rabbi Yaakov, Tanya, we learned in the Brisa. Afal pisheino isha niknes bepachos mishava pruta, karka niknes bepachos mishava pruta. How could you say, Rabbi Yaakov, the opposite of what we have in a Brisa? Amar lahu, Rabbi Yaakov responded, Ki Tanya he, with regard to what did the Brisa mean to exclude pachos mishava pruta in karka? Bechalipin. Now let's review the basics. Kinyan Chalipa, which is derived from a pasuk in Megillas Rus, is effective even with a kli that's not worth a pruta. So therefore, when it says in the Brisa that karka niknes b'pachos mishav pruta, it's talking about a kli that's being used for Chalipa. The sanya konim b'kli afal pisha ein bo shava pruta. But if he wants to buy a piece of karka, a piece of real estate with a kinyan kesef, not with chalipin, then the kinyan is not valid if it's less than a shava pruta. So therefore, when Rav Asi made a statement that karka is ein a niknes b'pachos shava pruta, he's correct. There's a price that says niknes, karka niknes shava, but that's already a case of chalipin, which is valid even in the case of a pachos mishav pruta, like a sudar or a kli, whatever it might be. You could actually effectuate chalip with a toothpick. Hadar Yasve v'ka'amri, the Chachamim got together and they wanted to hear more and more from Rav Asi, who died. Hadi Amar Rabbi Yehuda Mishmul Kol Sheni Yodeh B'Tiv Gitnu Kiddushin Lo Ye'esek Imohem Amar Rabbi Asi Amar Rabbi Yochanan V'Koshin Li'olam Midor Amabu. If somebody presents himself as a rabbi and he wants to answer a question about Gittin and Kiddushin, whether she's married, she's not married, and he's not a baki in halachos, and Rav Yehuda Mishmul warns him, don't get involved in being mora hora in Gittin and Kiddushin if you're not an absolute baki. Because if through your error she marries someone else and she'll have children, and those children are mamzerim, is kashim li olam midar mabu, yosem midar mabu. The people who get involved in being mora hora begitnu kiddushin and they don't know beans about what they're talking about. Like, for example, I learned shemus gittin. It took me a full year to learn shemus gittin. Is therefore their sin is worse than the Dharamavel. And now we're going to get into a drasha in a pasuk in Hosea Novi to prove that this sin of eventually causing mamzerus is worse than the Dharamavel. Shenemar, 4th chapter of Hosea. Olo v'kachesh, the word v'kachesh is referring to a person who perjured himself in the oath that he took a false oath. And then it says, V'ratzoach, if he's guilty of murder, V'ganov, and he's guilty of gneva, V'na'of, and he's guilty of znus, is the end of the pasuk says, Paratzu, which we're going to say is a remez for causing mamzeris, V'damim nago. So what does damim v'damim nago means? As a result of these averos, techarev haaretz. Anyway, we see clearly that these chatoim are more severe for the world, and they bring churban and absolute destruction to the world. So my mashma, how do we see from this pasuk that the onesh is because of the avera of Eishes Ish? She was matir in Eishes Ish, can have targum Rav Yosef, it derived from the Tirgum of Rav Yosef, and that is the word paratzu. What is paratzu? Paratzu, like in the pasuk, partzu es. Just 1 second, where is it? We have a pasuk also, Kashayanu also Kain Yifratz Kain Yiprots. But I had in mind a different pasuk. Just 1 second. I'm not finding the pasuk. You remember that after the Shivim Nefashos left Mitzrayim, the pasuk says Yifritzu, that they multiplied at a very fast rate. Or maybe that's coming up in the Gemara. Anyway, that's what I remember. So paratzu means they brought children into the world. Molidin banim minishei chavreim. Since they were matir this woman illegitimately, because they weren't bekiyim in halacha, she went ahead and got married with someone else, and the child from that union is a mamzer. Is chovin al chovin mosifin. The pasuk says v'damim nago, and they are being mosif chet on top of chet. These are those who are matur neshesish because they're not baki, they're not bekiyim in tiv gitnu Kiddushin, and they're going to cause mamzerus. Uksiv, in the next pasuk it says there in Hosea al kain, because of these averos, the whole list, which includes murder and theft. Al kain, the end of the pasuk says te'ebal, which means techarev ha'aretz v'umla, cut off. Kol yoshvei yoshek ba v'chayes hasod b'of hashamayim. Guess what? In this context, the onesh is greater than that of the Dor Mabul because Gam, the pasuk says, Gam tegei hayom yeisafru. Even as a result of man's sins in this area of arayos, of Eishes Ish, it's going to cause even the fish to die. No mention of dagim. But here in the pasuk in Hosea, afilu dagim shebayam. This indicates the severity of bringing mamzerim into the world. But wait a minute. The pasuk in Hosea has an entire enumerated list of these averos. Maybe you have to do all of them in order to supersede the severity of the Dor Mabul. Here it says, although, which is referring to a false oath, v'kachesh, ratzoach, gonov, etc., etc. But for the avera of causing niuf and being molid mamzerim, that avera per se is not so chomer. The Gemara says, Lo salkadaito, you can't say that everything mentioned in that pasuk is part of an entire package of an enterprise, and only when you have all of them together, then it becomes an avera that's worse than the dar mabul. Lo sal kedaita. Tichsiv, in a pasuk in Yirmi it says, Ki mipnei ela avla mipnei ola of the haaretz. Ola is a shvur sheker, and we lost the land. It became desolate. So we see that the avera shvur sheker in and of itself is enough to bring churban to the entire Eretz Yisrael. So the pasuk in Hosea, when it lists all those different chatoim, and amongst that list we had paratzu, which means gili arayis and bringing mamzerim into the world. The Navi means to tell us that each one of these avonos, in and of themselves, could bring total destruction to the earth. And amongst them is paratzu. Maybe we should say that after the oven of Shvua Sheker of Allah, that in and of itself could bring the Churban to the land of Israel. But Hanach Lechudayu, the bulk or the remainder of all the Averos that are mentioned in the Pasuk, they themselves, if done exclusively by them, that Avera, is we need to create an entity. It's only b'tztarfusom yachad, when all of these Averas were committed one after the other. So we don't have any proof that the Mora Hora that'll cause Mamzeris, that itself is worse than the Dharma. So if Nachman answers, I'm sorry, I lost the place here for a second. Oh, Miksiv. Right, so for this, I think we have to turn to Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis. Let me just make sure I didn't skip anything. I think I got everything in.